Every day, her teacher mocked her, tore her down, and laughed at her struggles. But one moment made her regret it all. Keisha walked into her classroom every morning with a quiet determination. At just 14 years old, she already knew life wasn't fair, but nothing prepared her for the daily humiliation she faced from her own teacher, Mrs. Grayson. The classroom, a space meant for learning and growth, felt more like a battlefield. Mrs. Grayson, a white woman in her 50s, had a sharp tongue and a clear bias, and Keisha was her favorite target. "Keisha, you'll never get it right, will you?" she would say loud enough for the whole class to hear, as if she enjoyed the laughter that followed. Keisha wasn't the type to cause trouble or argue back. She kept her head down and stayed quiet, letting the insults roll over her. But inside, each word cut deeper than the last. Her classmates, some sympathetic but too scared to speak up, looked away. Others joined in the laughter, eager to stay on the teacher's good side. For Mrs. Grayson, it wasn't just about academics. It was personal. Keisha's presence seemed to irritate her, as though she didn't belong in the front row with the other bright students. The subtle comments, "Maybe you should try something easier," or "That's a little advanced for you," were designed to make Keisha feel small. But what Mrs. Grayson didn't realize was that Keisha wasn't broken. She was building something inside. Behind her silence was a fierce determination to prove everyone wrong. She didn't need validation from Mrs. Grayson or her classmates. Every insult fueled her resolve. Every snicker gave her more reason to succeed. And even though no one could see it yet, something big was coming. Keisha wasn't going to stay quiet forever. Mrs. Grayson's disdain for Keisha wasn't subtle. It was woven into her daily routine. During one math lesson, as Keisha raised her hand to answer a question, Mrs. Grayson sighed loudly. "Keisha, let someone else try this time. You've had enough chances to get it wrong," she said, rolling her eyes. The class chuckled uncomfortably, while Keisha lowered her hand, her cheeks burning. It wasn't just in the classroom. Mrs. Grayson's comments followed her everywhere. At parent-teacher night, she told Keisha's mother, "I think Keisha would do better in a slower-paced environment. She struggles to keep up with the class." The statement wasn't just false. It was meant to cut deep, and it did. Her mother left the meeting upset, but Keisha comforted her, saying, "It's okay, Mom. I'll prove her wrong." The breaking point came when the school announced a major exam that would determine final grades. Mrs. Grayson made no effort to hide her doubt. "This exam isn't for everyone," she said one morning, glancing at Keisha. "Some of you may want to focus on easier goals." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Keisha felt the familiar sting of humiliation. But this time, it was different. This time, the sting turned into resolve. That night, Keisha spread her textbooks across the dining table, ignoring the exhaustion from her long day. While Mrs. Grayson saw her as incapable, Keisha saw the exam as an opportunity to prove her wrong. She worked harder than she ever had, pouring hours into preparation. Mrs. Grayson thought she'd won, but Keisha wasn't just preparing for an exam. She was preparing to shatter every stereotype and expectation her teacher had placed on her. The stakes were clear now, and Keisha was ready. The week leading up to the exam was intense. Keisha spent every evening at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes, textbooks, and practice tests. Her determination grew with each passing day. Mrs. Grayson's sneers replayed in her mind, but instead of bringing her down, they fueled her. This wasn't just about passing a test. It was about proving she belonged, no matter what anyone thought. In class, Mrs. Grayson continued to pile on the pressure. She announced the exam details in her usual condescending tone. This test will separate the serious students from, well, the others, she said, her eyes landing squarely on Keisha. Some students exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak up. Keisha kept her head down, quietly focusing on her goal. As exam day approached, Keisha doubled down. Her mother noticed the late nights and exhaustion, but didn't discourage her. "You've got this," her mom whispered, offering silent support. Keisha nodded, knowing she couldn't afford to fail, not for herself, not for anyone. The tension in the classroom on the morning of the test was palpable. Mrs. Grayson handed out the papers with her usual smirk, pausing as she dropped Keisha's on her desk. "Good luck," she said sarcastically, as if the outcome was already decided. Keisha didn't flinch. She took a deep breath and began, her pencil moving with purpose. Hours later, when the test was over, Mrs. Grayson collected the papers and shot Keisha a quick glance. For the first time, Keisha felt something different, confidence. The hard part wasn't over yet, but she knew she had given it everything. Now, all she could do was wait for the results that would change everything. The tension only grew as the class anticipated what was coming next. The day the test results were revealed, the air in the classroom was thick with anticipation. Mrs. Grayson stood at the front of the room, a stack of papers in her hands, her usual smug expression firmly in place. She glanced at Keisha, her smirk widening. It was as if she'd already decided that Keisha had failed. The students watched silently, their eyes darting between Mrs. Grayson and Keisha, sensing the unspoken tension. Mrs. Grayson began calling out names, handing back the graded exams one by one. Each time she handed a paper to a student, she offered a quick word of praise or disappointment. "Good effort, but not quite there. Excellent work as expected." But when she reached Keisha's name, she paused. Her confident smirk faltered for a brief moment as she stared at the paper in her hand. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Keisha sat still, her heart racing, but her face showed no fear. "Keisha," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice strained, "you got the highest score in the class." Her words seemed to echo in the silence, and for a moment no one spoke. All eyes turned to Keisha, who blinked in surprise before a quiet smile spread across her face. The shock on Mrs. Grayson's face was undeniable. This wasn't part of her plan. Before Mrs. Grayson could move on, one of the students raised their hand. "Mrs. Grayson, there's something wrong with my paper," they said. You marked a correct answer wrong." The comment sparked a chain reaction. Other students began reviewing their papers and noticing inconsistencies. "Mine too," one student said. "She marked a lot of stuff wrong that's actually right." The murmurs in the classroom grew louder, and the focus shifted back to Mrs. Grayson, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. Another student spoke up. "Keisha's paper, too. She had some of the same questions as me, but I got them marked right." The classroom was no longer silent. It was buzzing with outrage. The realization hit like a tidal wave. Mrs. Grayson had deliberately marked Keisha's answers wrong, likely hoping to lower her grade. The principal was called into the classroom, and the truth unraveled quickly. The students, empowered by the discovery, showed their test papers as evidence of Mrs. Grayson's manipulation. The principal reviewed the papers and demanded an explanation from Mrs. Grayson, who stammered excuses that no one believed. Keisha remained calm throughout the chaos, sitting in her seat as the truth came to light. She didn't need to say a word. Her work, her success, and the support of her classmates spoke for her. By the end of the day, Mrs. Grayson was escorted out of the school, her actions exposed for everyone to see. Keisha's victory was complete. Not only had she earned the highest score, but she had also proven that no amount of bias or sabotage could stop her. The classroom that had once felt like a hostile place was now filled with respect and admiration for Keisha, who had stood tall through it all. The fallout from Mrs. Grayson's actions was swift and severe. By the time the school day ended, nearly every parent, teacher, and student had heard about the incident. The principal immediately launched a formal investigation, starting with interviews and a review of all the test papers. It became clear that this wasn't a one-time event. Mrs. Grayson's bias had been a pattern, especially toward Black students like Keisha. Complaints that had once been ignored or dismissed resurfaced, painting a damning picture of her behavior. Mrs. Grayson was suspended indefinitely, pending further action. As she walked out of the school building that day, escorted by security, the weight of her disgrace was palpable. For someone who had carried herself with so much arrogance, the humiliation was undeniable. Her career, once built on a facade of authority, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Meanwhile, Keisha found herself at the center of a growing conversation. Her classmates, many of whom had stayed silent in the past, now approached her with support and apologies. "I should have said something earlier," one of them admitted. Keisha accepted their words graciously. She wasn't bitter. She was relieved. For the first time, she felt seen and respected for who she was, not judged by someone else's prejudice. At home, Keisha shared the news with her mom, who hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you could do it," her mother said. Keisha smiled, knowing she had done more than prove her teacher wrong. She had shown herself and everyone around her the power of resilience and integrity. The school administration promised changes to prevent such incidents in the future. For Keisha, the battle was over, but the impact of her courage would last far beyond that classroom. Keisha's victory extended far beyond the classroom. The school implemented new policies to address discrimination, ensuring no student would face the same bias she endured. Teachers were required to attend diversity and inclusion training, and a zero-tolerance policy for prejudice was enforced. The principal even reached out to Keisha and her mother, apologizing personally for the failure to act sooner and commending Keisha for her resilience. For Keisha, the experience marked a turning point. She no longer walked into school feeling small or overlooked. Her classmates now looked at her with respect, and many even thanked her for exposing the injustice they had silently endured. Keisha, once a quiet and unassuming student, became a role model for her peers. She showed that standing up, even when it's hard, can lead to meaningful change. At home, Keisha reflected on how far she'd come. The insults and humiliation that once stung so deeply no longer had power over her. Instead, they became a reminder of her strength and determination. She learned that success is the best response to prejudice and that no one's opinion could define her worth. Keisha emerged from the ordeal stronger, knowing she had not only changed her life, but inspired others to believe in themselves too. The moral of Keisha's story is simple yet powerful. Never let others define your worth. People may try to tear you down with prejudice or negativity, but your strength, determination, and belief in yourself can overcome any obstacle. Keisha's perseverance proved that actions speak louder than words, and success is the ultimate response to hatred. Her journey reminds us that even in the face of unfairness, resilience can inspire change and leave a lasting impact on the world around you. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, or check out the next video to see another life-changing moment.